Okay, great. Next slide, please. The next slide, or second driver, is the uptake of complex systems analysis in international development, which stresses the interdependence that systems are more than just the sums of their parts. On the right, you're hopefully all familiar with the SDGs, and there's been quite a lot of work looking at the interrelationships between them, which the 2030 Global Agenda Framework is built upon. And on the left is a complexity map highlighting the global risks and their interconnections, and that's from 2020 from the World Economic Forum. Next slide, please. The uptake of complex theory and systems thinking and evaluation is in itself the start of a powerful paradigm shift or transformation in the field of evaluation. And here I just have a few of the many different books, and there's a multitude of articles and research papers and applied practices that are happening in evaluation to pursue complex systems analysis that takes more attention to the larger system in which the interventions are delivered and doesn't just fixate on the predetermined goals and the logic model, theory of change, or whatever framework is used to frame the intervention. And next slide, please. And the last driver is what you can call the political economy of the marketplace in which evaluation is embedded. Evaluation does follow market trends, and with the adoption of the UN's 2030 agenda, which has transformation in its title, the development industry coalesced around the transformational agenda. And with that, there's been a demand for evaluation of transformational change. I know this firsthand because I've done some of those evaluations. And it's also been accompanied by scholarly articles, books, blogs, university courses, workshops, and webinars like this right now. So that's the end of my slides. In my work on evaluation and transformational change, I've identified the boxes and barriers of transformational change, as well as the enablers or bridges to enhance evaluation's transformational potential. And this includes trends that can have both positive and negative consequences, such as the transformation of data science in AI, which is a transformation unfolding right before us right now, which can be used positively but also negatively in evaluation and beyond. It also includes other promising trends, such as the intention on indigenous evaluation, and critical for this session, the role of young and emerging evaluators in the future of evaluation and its transformational potential. The transformations of tomorrow will come from the young visionaries of today. And I don't romanticize the future that the younger generation will inherit, but it's becoming increasingly complex, daunting, and I think, again, a lot of the people on a session like this is familiar with this. Yet I am deeply inspired by the young and emerging evaluators, and those we'll hear from today will illustrate why. In fact, I often don't call them young and emerging evaluators because they're fully emerged professionals. And given their exceptional competence, extensive experience, and valuable insights, they bring a lot to the table. And with that, I'm going to hand it over back to, I think, Roxana, to introduce the first speaker. I don't know if Joy, you had anything you wanted to add, or if you're going to be doing your piece towards the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, for the introduction on why this topic is important. And Joy, we will even, approfundize and talking more about what you mentioned before, enablers as well, and how this transformation evaluation can look, can take different shapes. So I will just go back to you, Joy.
Thank you, Roxana, and thank you, Scott, for that very great introduction. So I'll just go straight towards my slides. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So from Scott's presentation, what we've gathered is that evaluation is indeed uniquely positioned to contribute to transformational change, but its potential highly depends on its ability to transform from within. So what we're saying is that, or what we already know is that evaluation does not exist in a vacuum. It's embedded in systems that are deeply interconnected. And key to the systems are power structures, which influence the evaluation design, the implementation, as well as its use. So for transformation of evaluation to be more meaningful and impactful, it must be accompanied by efforts to redistribute power. We have to do this so that the evaluation process can genuinely reflect and address diverse needs and perspectives. So once this is done, then we can ensure that evaluation processes and outcomes are not only informative, but also transformative, and in that they promote equity, justice, and shared decision-making if we're indeed to confront this global crisis and challenges that we are currently facing. So with evaluation as a key tool or method for determining the merit, value, or worth of the interventions that we implement, then we can use it to shift the power in our systems. When we're shifting the power, what we are saying is that we are determining new ways of deciding and doing. And how we evaluators conceive and manage power issues in evaluation can either reinforce, establish power structures, or challenge them altogether. So we must be able to define as evaluators whose reality counts, who holds the power, who does not hold the power, and how do these power issues inform evaluation processes. Such questions allow us to reconsider evaluation practices and priorities as well, so that we can be able to reflect on diverse approaches to knowledge construction. Next slide, please. So with these reflections in mind, we can ask ourselves these very essential questions and many more that arise throughout our work. But key to that is that these reflections on power shift can allow us to envision what evaluation that shifts the power actually looks like. And it can take many forms. The beauty of having new perspectives is that different approaches can be adopted. For example, what we have now, we have participatory approaches, which community-led evaluations. We also have what we are advocating for now more, the youth-led evaluations, approaching evaluation from a feminist lens as well. But at the core of this is that traditional structures of evaluation are disrupted so that we can create more inclusive and equitable participatory processes. And the result of this is that our evaluations remain truly reflective of and responsive to the needs and aspirations of those we intend to serve, the communities, the beneficiaries. The value of this is that it leads to sustainable change. And that's what we're seeking to achieve, positive sustainable change, that is. And we have increased trust and buy-in from our communities. We also, because they're able to engage with the findings and recommendations. And there's also enhanced relevance in that we're able to capture the complexities of the local context, and we can enhance empowerment of our communities. So with this in mind, we can ask ourselves then what needs to change. And several systematic, structural, and procedural changes are needed. But this, of course, can be a challenge because we already have established power dynamics, which are confined in our institutions, in our present hierarchical structures as well, in our attitudes also as evaluators, in our frameworks and policies. Several structures already exist that are determined by the power imbalances that are occurring. But what we're saying is that we need to be intentional with our actions. That's the main driver of how we can be able to transform evaluation and not just have all our actions as lip service. We need to move beyond the hashtags and online campaigns to concrete actionable plans and develop practical and sustainable alternatives so that we can have tangible outcomes. Next slide, please. So because we work highly in our work is mainly project-based, and we work with our projects as being highly aid-driven, and we come from multilateral organizations like as myself, or international NGOs, local CSOs, we need to already call out how these power structures manifest in the development sector, because they shape how we conduct our evaluation. They have a high influence on the power in and the power of evaluation. So with the power in, what we are trying to say is the power in of evaluation talks of the evaluation process from the design to the implementation, to the conclusion, to the communication of evaluation results. So these power structures trigger how we as evaluators use our power throughout the evaluation process. For example, in the design, do we consider the communities and involve them and the other stakeholders throughout the start of the evaluation process? And when we're talking about the power of evaluation, is that we're looking at the relevance, the quality, the timing of evaluations with regards to the policy windows, and how we will use this evaluation. So these power structures manifest in several ways. These are just but some of the ones that we can quickly see, and also what I've encountered in my work. So a key one is the organizational structure and partnerships. And here we see that partnerships are usually between the global north and the global south. They are usually in a top-down approach, with donors being mainly from the global north. They design these partnership agreements and the governance structures. So partners from the south, our CSOs, they have limited power. And this therefore means that less decision-making for the beneficiaries that are intended with our interventions. And you also find that our evaluation processes are therefore tied to donor timetables. They're not really aligning with local realities and priorities. The same applies to how we go about the funding and the resourcing. Funding is sometimes allocated on short periods, with donors setting priorities, objectives, and the scopes of evaluation, which again may not align to the needs of the interests of the communities being evaluated. They have little say in the decision-making process. And a key aspect also, it lies with the leadership, which cuts across most of these power structures. Leadership remains unequally distributed. We have beneficiaries and communities, again, having minimal input in the decision-making process. So, so these are just some of the means of how power imbalances are manifested in our development sectors, which we need to address if at all we are to transform the systems within which evaluation exists. Next slide, please. For example, for the organizational structures and partnerships, we can move towards embracing new alternatives. For example, embracing localization. We can create balanced partnerships with new organization models that allow for better partnerships, especially with the communities, so that they can be more involved in the decision-making process throughout the evaluation system. We can also have inclusive funding mechanisms that benefit communities. For example, having more room for participatory evaluations. And we can also, through our leadership, we can foster greater diversity and inclusion. For example, what we are advocating for in this webinar, having more youth-led evaluations and the power of the youth as evaluators. We need to steer ourselves as evaluators, move ourselves from the leadership role and act as more of facilitators, so we can give the beneficiaries, the communities, those who we are doing these interventions for, more leadership roles so that they can have more control and agency over their own development, over their own futures. Next slide, please, Anna. So from these power structures and imbalances, we can see there are several ways within which we can improve or introduce new alternatives. That is our main driver at this stage. New alternatives that can allow us to shift the power. But we do know that the journey can be different for us because we all operate in different contexts. We undertake our evaluations in different geographical locations and the different scenarios. However, we do need to remain, we are aligned towards the same goal and vision. And at the forefront, again, I insist is that we ought to be intentional, not remaining as lip service on what we say, but we need to be intentional in embracing these new pathways that can allow evaluation to transform and better support transformational change. At this point, I'd like to hand over back to Roxana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy, for the reflections. And yeah, something that a key message that came from the reflection is also about intentionality and being intentional about our understandings and also actions. And we will see then in the next presentation. So how we can more specific examples about understandings and how do we apply this to the evaluation sphere. So I would like to pass the word to Teresa, who will be presenting the case that she has developed along with her colleagues about disrupting impact narratives for system transformation. So over to you, Teresa.
Thanks so much, Roxana, and also Joy and Scott for the great introduction to this exciting session. Maybe just to kick off right away, we can move to the next slide, where I can present a little bit where I come from. So I work for Welthungerhilfe, which is one of Germany's largest NGOs within international cooperation and humanitarian action, working towards zero hunger. Our vision is a world in which everyone has the chance to exercise their right to self-determined life in dignity and justice, free from hunger and poverty. And we recognize that addressing global challenges like hunger and poverty requires us to work on system strengthening and transformation. And it involves us to focus on key areas and leverage points that lead to the most impactful improvements. Next slide. We believe that systemic understanding of impact is a foundation for system transformation. Our understanding of impact can encourage us to consider how we collaborate with system actors, how we can disrupt vicious cycles of reinforcing negative change, and how we can sustain and scale positive change. Needless to say that recent discourses and modalities in international cooperation and humanitarian action, like localization, decolonization, and power shift that Joy was just talking about, challenge the established definitions of impact. So we go as far as, you can still go back. Yeah. So we go as far as to say that non-systemic understanding of impact is no longer appropriate, since our definitions are the basis for what we measure. What we measure is the prerequisite to identify what works to impact systems, and identifying what works is a basis to scale and achieve greater impact. Next slide. Right. So the transformation imperative has prompted our initiative to reevaluate our definitions and ensure they accurately reflect our aspirations for fundamental system transformative changes. To this end, we have undertaken a study that compares impact definitions of more than 40 actors, including international institutions, development agencies, NGOs, and think tanks, as a basis for refinement of impact definitions. And the key findings include that, firstly, actors emphasize causal effect relationships as a core attribute of impact. And secondly, that a systemic interpretation of impact is still inconsistent. Next. And as part of this study, we proposed 6 attributes that characterize impact. And we analyzed how the actors whose definitions we reviewed integrate these attributes into their impact definitions. Causality has shown to be, as I mentioned, shown to be the key attribute, as all the actors who have essentially included causality in their definitions. But they were split on their interpretation of causality. Some interpreted it as attribution, which is the extent to which the observed change is the result of the intervention. And others interpreted it as contribution, which examines the intervention's role among numerous causes in a complex system, validating causal theories and scrutinizing various factors to reduce uncertainty about the intervention's contribution to the change. Some interpreted it as both contribution and attribution, but essentially the bottom line is that the way how actors interpret the attribute of causality defines how systemic their interpretation of impact is. And we have also drawn on other attributes, and the way how actors describe those has equally defined whether and how they consider systemic impact. For example, subject of change. Are we looking for change only on the level of people, households, or at the level of systems as well? Or dimensions of change, which are the domains where impact is measured. Do we consider only reach and magnitude of change, or also duration of change and equity, or how equitable the change is across groups? Next. Further, we have found out that we can't redefine impact without redefining outcomes as well. And we found two ways to distinguish between outcomes and impact. The first way is by putting emphasis on the level of change. And this implies that impact follows outcomes, whereby impact is reached when the highest level or long-term effect has occurred. This approach can be critiqued for two reasons. Firstly, what is higher level or long-term is not clearly and uniformly understood across actors and across contexts. And secondly, the actors who use this approach usually view outcomes as effects of outputs and impact as effects of outcomes, meaning they refer to causality in both outcomes and impact definitions and set a condition that is difficult to satisfy in practice. We have therefore found the second approach, which is highlighted or illustrated on the right side of this slide. And the second approach of emphasizing causality to distinguish between outcomes and impact as more pragmatic and more conceptually coherent. Emphasizing causality means that actors only include reference to causal effects in impact definition and not in the outcome definition. And this approach essentially views outcomes as changes in variables of interest that are plausibly linked to interventions, so that are perhaps assumed to be linked to interventions. These outcomes then qualify as impact when causality is established. So measurement of impact involves establishing a causal link or showing that the causal link is probable using right fit evidence to minimize the uncertainty about the intervention's contribution to the change. Next and final slide. Based on the second model, we then propose a new classification scheme that departs from seeing impact as the end of the result chain and outcomes as only the intermediate changes. In our model, outcomes and impact are distinguished based on the substantiation of causal linkages. So outcomes are observable changes that are assumed to be causally linked to intervention based on prior evidence, knowledge, or theoretical deduction. And we propose three levels of outcomes: higher level, intermediate, and systemic. And essentially change at any level can be viewed as impact if causality between the intervention and the outcome or the change is established. For instance, by means of contribution or attribution. That means that investigation into impact requires reflection and examination of our and also other actors' role in bringing about the change. Now, this model allows for interventions to have multiple impacts, to have unintended impacts, to have impacts at any levels, and most importantly, to have impact on systems as such. In the case when we show the causal link between systemic change and the intervention. So, for example, if our intervention contributes to passing of a land rights regulation, contributing to zero hunger, other actors may contribute to the land rights regulation too, but as part of our examination of impact, we would rigorously reflect on our role of contributing to the regulation and trace what worked in bringing about the change in order to leverage on it and scale it further. And with this, I will hand over back to you, Roxana.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for the great presentation. And I think it's a lot of food for thought from the presentation. And I would just like to invite you, if you already have some reflections, such as me, in your mind, to already write them down, or you can already start putting them in the chat. So while we also hear the experience of our next experience, that is somehow linked as well. and about transformational change and an international NGO. So we will have Dr. Brittany from CARE, who will be presenting the case. And yeah, I invite you to already post some questions in the chat in case you have something, any reflections or questions. And yeah, without further ado, I just would like to invite Brittany to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Roxana and Yolinka, and it's a delight to follow Joy and Scott and Teresa for some really thought-provoking framing. Good morning from the United States, where I'm based. To give you a little bit of insight into where I'm coming from on this topic, as Roxana mentioned, I lead Systems Level Impact, which is an initiative of CARE, which is an international NGO that seeks to eradicate poverty with a particular focus on women and girls. And I also co-chair the American Evaluation Association Systems and Evaluation Topical Interest Group, or SEDIG. And I see that Hyatt Askar is also on this call, who's my partner in crime and co-chair. So that I just share that as I think about this work, both from the perspective of my day job at CARE, but also alluding to some of what Scott and Joy were talking about around just like what are the trends we're seeing overall in the sector as we think about systems change and systems impact, and how as evaluators do we measure that. So I wanted to share a bit about how CARE is thinking about systems level impact, and then give you one concrete example, really building off Joy's comments about how we've tried to shift power. So if you go to the next slide, please. So CARE is thinking about impact in 3 buckets. And I actually think this is like super interesting to have a bit of a split screen with what Teresa was just saying as another INGO thinking about impact in different ways. So we have direct program impact, which is more of the traditional way that I would say NGOs have thought about impact. You provide food assistance, you provide shelter, you provide cash assistance, you count how many people's lives are better as a result of that direct intervention. I spend a lot of time thinking about our systems level outcomes and systems level impact, and we have 6 pathways that I'll show on the next slide of how we do that, but really thinking about some of those definitions Scott was sharing at the beginning, like what are those transformational changes that are deeply shifting structures and systems and ultimately make people's lives better. And then our third category is what we're calling catalytic impact, which is where a government or actor or entity takes an intervention or something that CARE started and basically takes it and run with it. So the analogy I often use is if you throw a rock into a pond, perhaps the original intervention was started by CARE, but those ripple effects, those cascading effects of the waves rippling out from that stone being thrown in the pond is catalytic impact. So for example, the UN FAO took a gender component of CARE's farmer, field, and business school model, and now is including that gender module in all of their farmer, field, and business school programming. So like that's an example of catalytic impact. So we're trying to think about how we evaluate and make change across our very large portfolio in these 3 buckets. Next slide, please. So in our strategy, we have 6 what we call pathways, but they're really like strategies for how we make systems level change. So advocacy, including influencing policy change, shifting social norms, since a big component of CARE's work is gender equity, there's a lot of work to shift social norms, supporting social movements, service system strengthening and social accountability, which often looks like technical assistance to government or holding duty bearers accountable for previous commitments they've made, inclusive market-based approaches, so thinking about the role of the private sector, and then finally scaling and adapting proven models. So when we find solutions that work, how do we make sure they're simple, affordable, and cost-effective so that they can be scaled elsewhere? Next slide. So I included this slide just in case it's helpful. I know probably people on this call are coming from lots of different backgrounds, but just conceptually how we're thinking about transformation and systems level impact specifically. Our theory of change says that to achieve gender equity, we need to shift interventions at 3 levels: building agency, changing relations, and transforming structures. Historically, a lot of CARES programming, and I think for many INGOs, has really focused on that building agency at the individual level. That's incredibly important, but that alone is not going to be transformational. Shift systems and shift structures. So the systems level impact work that I lead and get to work on with others at CARE is really focused on this changing relations and transforming structures, because we know that is incredibly important in order to achieve gender equity and dismantle the patriarchy. Next slide. So I wanted to just give one concrete example here before we get into discussion and Q&A of how we have approached these systems level impact interventions in a way that also shifts power. So this is an example from our Women's Voice and Leadership in Humanitarian Settings project, which is funded by USAID, Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. It is a project that is working in 4 countries: Nepal, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Colombia. And from the beginning, we set up the evaluation framework for this project in a way that was explicitly feminist, explicitly thought to shift power. And it's just been, I've been at CARE for 2.5 years, and we started this project about 1.5 years ago. So we're about 18 months in. It has been such a learning experience, especially when you're working with a big institutional funder like USAID. I don't know if anyone from USAID is on this call, but we had to do so much, even at the proposal phase, to push back against what Joy described around people in the global north setting agendas. So things like refusing to fill out an indicator tracking table until we had all the partners on board and we could fill it out in a consensus model, and not just, me sitting in the United States, like deciding what the indicators would be. The way we have set up the consortium is that there's a lead learning partner in each country, which is an established women-led organization who does all the data collection, analysis, etc., has a lot of control and agency around how they're tracking and evaluating the project in their context. And then at a global level, I, along with colleagues at CARE, do some synthesis and shared learning to try and tell a global story. So if you go to the next slide. So we have thought about evaluation and learning just in a very different way. As I said, it's feminist, it's locally driven and participatory, really centering the needs of women-led organizations. And that has meant that it doesn't look like a traditional evaluation where you set things out at a proposal phase, you do a traditional baseline, and you kind of check off a list. We've really gone back and revised things over time based on conversations with partners. We've shifted as on the ground realities have changed. So it's been very adaptive, which to me, as we think about what does transformational evaluation look like, what does shifting power look like, it is this new dynamic way of working. And just to kind of make a final point, to give one example on how we did the baseline, it was a mixed methods approach. Our lead learning partners collected the data in each country, and then the data analysis was also very participatory, including women-led organizations in the country, the lead learning partners synthesizing findings at a global level, along with those of us who sit on a global team. So I share that example. I'm sure other folks perhaps have other ones that we can talk about in the discussion. But to me, this is the really exciting work that can shift how we're doing some traditional evaluation. So I will hand it back to you, Roxana. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for your presentation. And thank you, everyone, all the speakers, for providing your experience on how you have been using evaluation and challenging evaluation approaches for transformational change. And I just would like also to know, I just would like to open up the floor. And I see that to also hear reflections from the audience, but also if you have any questions or any thoughts, anything that you would like to share, feel free to raise your hand or to post it in the chat as well. And yeah, we will be sharing the recording afterwards. But if not, I also have some questions myself. So I can perhaps start. And just going back to Brittany, just driving on your experience, I was wondering how we can encourage organizations. So if we were talking at the organizational level, how can we really encourage organizations to adopt systems that are different, to adopt systems and feminist lens in evaluation? So what incentives, let's say, they have, and what have been your experience with?
Yeah, thanks, Roxana. This is where I think, speaking from the perspective of CARE, we are very much still on our learning journey, and I would love to hear from the other panelists and audience members. CARE operates in 110 countries. And so just like the sheer breadth of trying to come up with frameworks that can be implemented in many different contexts, we also have a very decentralized organizational structure. So I'm one person and I can try and be persuasive, but it's just, to be very transparent, it's been a challenge to try and make this happen systematically across the organization. So some approaches, and I put the link in the chat to all of our published systems level impact evaluations we've done so far. We've gotten a lot faster and a lot better each one we have done. And so I think that has helped, like having a few test cases, and then you can build on that momentum. And to me, it's really been, and this is what I would encourage others, is just learn by doing. So we did our first set of evaluations, not really quite sure what we were doing, to be honest, but we learned a lot, and I think it's been very iterative. And similarly with this example I shared from the Women's Voice and Leadership Project, of just like trying it, seeing what works, learning from it, documenting that, and then being really willing to share that learning with others internally and externally. So I would say start somewhere, try it. You know, every organization is a little bit unique. And then build from that. The last piece I would say is, for us, we've had to be really clear with our teams that a systems level evaluation is not a traditional program evaluation. And we realized that, I see Scott nodding. We realized that after some of our teams were like, we're going to do a traditional evaluation and just like add on a sentence or two about systems, and then like that, you can't, right? You actually really need to design the evaluation with a systems lens from the beginning. So just little things like that I think we've learned along the way, but you only learn that by like getting into it and doing it. So I would say, don't be afraid to just dive in.
Thank you so much. And I see that we have already some questions in the chat. So I will just read this question. So Laura is asking regarding influencing systems change as strategies, if you include as well partnerships and network building, and how or whether partnerships and networks can contribute to irreversible and sustainable transformation. In case of Teresa or Brittany have any examples of this?
Sure. Yeah, I can perhaps take up this question and how this perhaps relates with our initiative on redefining impact. I would say from our side, we would see that actually system transformative impact is something that by its nature allows us to consciously consider sustainability of impact, meaning future impact, which does not necessarily manifest straight after project, but that might continue for longer and that might amplify itself. And from our side, I would absolutely see that this links very closely with with work, with partnerships, with network building, and so on. Because actually examining the causal link, or how the systemic change was brought about, and what role we and also other actors played in bringing about the change, helps us to essentially uncover the systemic elements that help to sustain impact. And I think that this is also a bit what Brittany has been talking about with her different pathways, with the different pathways to scaling impact. So I would see this reflection as a kind of nudge for programming to really consider consciously how they will engage five different types of actors, those being other organizations, the civil society, governmental actors, market actors, and research, in order to essentially sustain and scale positive impact in a sustainable manner, so sustainably, so impact that lasts, impact that is taken up by the local actors. And so in a way, this reflection or this pursuit of systemic impact is a way, is a nudge for programs to become more systemic by means of more dedicated and more conscious engagement with civil society, with market actors, with government, with research, with partners, with networks that are there. So I would absolutely see this going hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for sharing that. And I see that Dorothy has already question whether she would like to hear any talks related to, let's say, the focus or the tension between transformation and adaptive management. If you have any talk about this.
I'm happy to start, and then I'm sure others will also chime in. So what we have seen in our evaluations is that systems change is incredibly slow. It is not linear. You often have to measure the impact like 2 to 3 years after the project has ended, or after the advocacy win has happened, or whatever that systems change was, in order to actually see like how someone's life is better as a result of that change. So I'm trying to think if I would describe it as a tension, or more of just like, I think it is transformation is gradual. As much as I would love to have like a magic wand and like flip the switch, I think what we have seen is that it's actually a really slow process. And maybe what this question speaks to is the importance of documenting some of those milestones along the way to remind yourself that things are shifting. It might not be linear, and it might not be quick.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Would anyone else would like to share anything about this? In case you would like to, of course.
Maybe I can add to that as well from my perspective. I actually, when I saw the comment, tension between focus on transformation and adaptive management, I actually feel that transformation and adaptive management go quite well hand in hand, because a transformation is essentially oftentimes it's made up of incremental, slow changes that are cumulative, and that slowly, as Brittany mentioned, I would very much resonate that slowly build up to something larger. And I think that absolutely to support this kind of change, I actually see adaptive management as a really good instrument. Where I feel that not only evaluation, but I think more monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning more broadly should be integrated within. And I think this also links quite closely with utilization focused evaluation that is proposed by Michael Quinn Patton, as I feel that that integrating, really integrating evaluation, monitoring, so the whole meal framework within a management structure, and within adaptive management, within decision making, is really something that supports us to consciously reflect on the changes as we are seeing, as we are coming, so that we can draw on them, and so that we can support them, so that we can reinforce them and help them to occur faster at a bigger scale, and manifest themselves really. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. I don't see any other questions or reflections in the chat or any other hands raised. So just also in the interest of time, perhaps you would like to go to other sessions. There are also so many interesting sessions going on right now. I just would like to go back to other panelists. Perhaps, Scott, as you open the session as well and you introduce us to why was this topic important, if you had any final reflection that you would like to share after hearing all the speakers and the participants' reflections, if there is something that comes to your mind.
Oh, thanks. I think first of all, for me, this illustrates three different perspectives that are distinct, yet they're interrelated. And it highlights for me one of the premises of complex systems analysis, the transformational agenda and such, which I felt Joy kicked off really highlighting, and then it was echoed again by Teresa and Brittany, is that there's no one way to approach this. And the recognition of the importance of listening to and engaging the very people that we target in our development initiatives is not old. I mean, it's not young. It goes back to Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and even before that, right up through Robert Chambers. And there's just a lot looking at how to meaningfully engage people. And now I see it very much in the decolonization, localization agenda. And I do think it's bleeding into methods, as Teresa was deconstructing impact, and into practice as well, as I felt Brittany's presentation focused. And it was also, another example that she mentioned is the importance of the feminist perspective in evaluation, which really emphasizes inclusivity, equity, and social justice, and ensuring diverse voices and perspectives in evaluation. And that's not the monopoly of feminist evaluation, but it's a critically important contribution. Donna Merton's transformative evaluation also looks at presents a framework for social justice in evaluation. One of the things that I think resonated with me is, if you're going to be doing an evaluation that has a systems focus or a transformational focus, as Brittany says, it is rather distinct. Now, the first evaluation I did on that, because there aren't many TRs out there in terms of reference that reflect, look, we really want to do a evaluation of our transformational impact or systems impact. And the first one I did was of a practical action UNHCR project seeking to change the humanitarian sector in the uptake of renewable energy. And they did 3 evaluations, 2 evaluations on the field in the countries where they were piloting the new technology. And then the evaluation that I led, which was looking at the quote unquote global impact or system impact. So they recognize the importance of, you can look at a portfolio approach, if you want to call it, to evaluation, where you evaluate different aspects of what you're trying to achieve. And it was what rightfully pointed out, systems change might not be linear, and it might not be quick. I would add, it might not be quantifiable. Okay, you saw in Teresa's presentation, she looking at causality. Can you ever know what degree of causality definitively can be attributed to your intervention versus the multiplicity of other people trying to achieve what you're trying to achieve, particularly in areas like climate change, which I've done a lot of work, where the ultimate high KPI is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. How can you attribute your intervention to that versus the array of different factors and actors? So I think looking at contribution analysis rather than attribution analysis is becoming increasingly important. If you look at frameworks that are out there to assess transformational change, you'll see that many of them, I would argue most of them, do not adopt the OECD DAC criteria. If you go to the webpage for frequently asked questions on the DAC criteria from the OECD, you'll see that they say the criteria really aren't fit for purpose for evaluating transformational systems change. They're more program focused. Now, if you're familiar with Blue Marble evaluation, that's one of the key tenets of Blue Marble evaluation is we need to get away from this project focused mentality on our predetermined results and look at the larger context that the interventions that we evaluate are delivered in and what might be some of the positive or negative consequences on the ecosystem. For example, if you look at the OECD definition of sustainability, it's the degree to which the intervention can be just sustained after funding has ended. Well, if you go back to the Brentwood agreements, which I think, Brundtland agreements, which I think a lot of people on this call might have encountered in graduate school, where you take your 101 course on sustainable development, they were in the late 80s. Back then, sustainability wasn't the continuation of an intervention. Back then, sustainability meant that it was for the common good. It was sustainable with human and natural living systems. And when that doesn't happen, the efficacy or the long-term sustainability of the intervention might not be there. The other thing that came out of this is the learning by doing, which I think is incredibly important, which is iterative. And it's important to ask, how receptive are the organizations you're working with to experimentation, piloting new approaches, and to learning from failure, because it's only a failure if you fail to learn. And we need to remember that evaluation isn't just evaluating what's happened. Ex ante evaluation or diagnostic evaluation is evaluating context to decide what to design to happen. So the systems approach is also very important at that end of the continuum of evaluation, and thinking about how having that systems lens can help design interventions and being open to maybe them not working. So thinking a little bit more about monitoring as evaluation. So then you can pivot, and we talked about adaptive management. You can pivot, course correct, and adaptively manage. And so I think a lot of what I heard from Joy, Brittany, and Teresa were all kind of in different ways touching on a lot of what I just tried to summarize. But for me, I hope you can tell why I think it's very inspiring to hear these voices of what we can say more junior evaluators that are really at the cutting edge. Either they're popping right out of university and they're on top of a lot of the cutting edge discourse and technology, or they're in the field. They haven't graduated up yet to the senior level office in some, in Paris, New York, or whatever. They're going to the field and they're working a lot, and they're seeing how this happens. And maybe it's no coincidence that other than myself, they're also all women on this session as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Scott. And yeah, and I just would like to thank everyone. And yeah, I see that also the audience is thanking the speakers for today. I just would like to thank the participants, the speaker, and anyone involved in this session for today. And I hope we have recorded the session, and we will be sharing with you the resources afterwards, and the recording, as well as any useful resource that can be useful for you. So thank you so much again for joining the session, and please do not hesitate to keep in touch in case you would like to continue the discussions about this. And have a nice rest of the day.
Well, big thanks
Thank
to you.
you.
Yeah, thanks, Roxana, as well for moderating, and to everyone else.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah,
you so
thank you.
much.